I'm Elena, I'm 28 years old. And yesterday, my own cousins tried to have my car towed from our grandmother's driveway because they said it was lowering the property value. The setting was a portrait of old money perfection. The Oak Ridge estate sat nestled behind wrought iron gates, the driveway lined with ancient weeping willows that dipped their branches into the morning mist. Everything smelled of damp cedar and expensive fertilizer. I sat in my 2005 sedan, the engine idling with a rhythmic metallic rattle that felt like a heartbeat in the middle of a library. The paint was peeling on the hood, a map of my struggles over the last 3 years, and the muffler gave one final exhausted puff of smoke before I turned the key. Outside, the air was crisp and smelled of the coming autumn. I stepped out, my heels clicking softly on the gravel. I was wearing a simple charcoal dress, high neck, modest hem, nothing like the silk and sequins I knew awaited me inside. As I approached the grand mahogany front doors, they swung open before I could even reach for the brass knocker. My cousin Sarah stood there, draped in a cream-colored cashmere wrap that probably cost more than my entire car. Her brother, Julian, stood behind her, swirling a glass of amber scotch even though it wasn't even noon yet. Sarah didn't hug me. She didn't even smile. She leaned against the doorframe and looked past me at the rusted hunk of metal sitting in the middle of the pristine circular drive. "Elena," she said, her voice dripping with a forced, sugary pity that felt like acid. "I told the gardener to leave the gate open for the delivery trucks, not for a junkyard exhibit. You really drove that thing all the way from the city? The oil stains on the cobblestone are going to be a nightmare to scrub." Julian let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "It's a safety hazard, Sarah. Honestly, Elena, have you no pride? Grandmama is turning 80 tonight. The governor is coming. Do you really want him to think we have a relative who lives like a vagrant? If you needed a ride, you could have just asked. I would have sent my driver to pick you up in a Range Rover. It would have saved us the second-hand embarrassment." The humiliation was a physical weight, cold and heavy in my chest. Around us, the house staff moved quietly, their eyes downcast, pretending not to hear the two heirs tearing into their cousin. I could see the neighbors' curtains twitching. In the world of the Oak Ridge family, reputation was the only currency that mattered. And, according to Sarah and Julian, I was bankrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them that I had more money in my savings account than they had in their entire trust fund. I didn't mention the 3 companies I had built from the ground up while they were busy spending their inheritance on yacht parties in Ibiza. Instead, I reached into my small unbranded leather bag and pulled out a simple, cream-colored envelope. I didn't hand it to them. I simply held it between my fingers, feeling the thick, premium weight of the paper. "I'm here for Grandmama's birthday, Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady. I didn't let it tremble. I kept my eyes fixed on hers until she was the one who had to look away. "The car gets me from point A to point B. It's reliable. Something you wouldn't know much about." I brushed past them, the scent of Sarah's expensive perfume cloying in my lungs. I walked into the foyer, where the marble floors shone like glass, reflecting the massive crystal chandelier above. I placed the envelope on the hallway table right next to the $5,000 crystal vase Julian had bought as a gift. Julian followed me, his face flushing a deep angry red. "Reliable is a disgrace. Just stay in the back during the party, Elena. Don't speak unless you're spoken to. We've told everyone you've been traveling to explain your absence, but one look at those shoes and they'll know the truth. You're a failure playing dress-up." I stopped at the base of the grand staircase and turned. I gave him a small, enigmatic smile. The kind of smile a cat gives a mouse it has already caught. "Don't worry, Julian," I whispered. "By the end of this weekend, everyone will know exactly who I am." Before I tell you what was in that envelope and why Julian's face turned pale when he finally peeked inside, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Now, let's go back to where it all began. Back to the night they threw me out into the rain with nothing but a suitcase and a dream they called a delusion. The silence of the Oak Ridge guest wing was always heavy, the kind of quiet that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. As I sat on the edge of the 4-poster bed, the silk duvet felt cold against my skin. My mind drifted back to 3 years ago, to the night the gold leaf on my life began to peel away. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because it was raining, the kind of relentless, gray downpour that turns the city into a watercolor painting of misery. I was 25 then, sitting in this very house, in the formal dining room. The table was set with the family's sterling silver, and the scent of roasted duck and expensive red wine filled the air. My father, the patriarch of the Oak Ridge Empire, had sat at the head of the table. He didn't look at me. He looked at his wineglass, rotating it slowly. Across from me sat Sarah and Julian, their faces glowing with a smug satisfaction they hadn't even tried to hide. Elena, my father had said, his voice as dry as the parchment of a legal contract. The merger with the Sterling Group is the only way to solidify our position in the European market. Arthur Sterling's son, Marcus, is a fine man. He's a Yale graduate. He's suitable. I remember the way my heart had hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. I wasn't a business asset to be traded. I was a person with a degree in computer science and a vision for a software platform that could revolutionize logistics. I had tried to explain it to him, the potential of my startup, the code I had been writing until 4 in the morning every night. I'm not marrying Marcus, Dad, I said, my voice barely a whisper. And I'm not joining the family firm to be a figurehead. I have my own company. I have my own path. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian had snickered, swirling his wine. Your company, Elena? You're playing with toys while we're running a legacy. You're being selfish. Think of the brand. My father finally looked at me. His eyes were like 2 pieces of flint. If you walk out that door to pursue this hobby, you walk out with nothing. No trust fund. No name. No Oak Ridge support. You will be a stranger to this family. You'll be lucky if you can afford a studio apartment in the slums. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. I looked at Sarah, who was busy inspecting her manicure, and at Julian, who wouldn't meet my gaze. Then I'm a stranger, I said. I walked out into that rain with a single suitcase and my laptop. I had $300 in my checking account and a car that was already 10 years old even then. My father's words followed me out. You'll be crawling back within a month, begging for a seat at this table. The first year was a blur of gray light and stale coffee. I lived in a basement apartment where the heater rattled like a dying beast and the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors. Every argument. I ate ramen noodles and worked 16 hours a day in a co-working space that smelled of ozone and desperation. I remember one specific night, 6 months in. My car, the same one that now sat in the Oak Ridge driveway, had broken down in the middle of a snowstorm. I couldn't afford a mechanic. I stood on the side of the road, my breath coming in white plumes, my fingers so numb I could barely hold the wrench. I cried then. Not because I missed the luxury, but because I was so tired. I had looked at my phone and saw a post from Sarah. She was in Paris, sipping champagne on a balcony overlooking the Eiffel Tower. The caption read, "Living the life I was born for. No regrets." I tucked my phone away, wiped my eyes, and got back under the hood. I didn't want their life. I wanted my own. Slowly, the lines of code began to stitch together into something beautiful. My logistics platform, Ether, caught the eye of a small venture capital firm, then a larger one. By the end of the second year, I wasn't just surviving. I was scaling. But I kept it quiet. I didn't update my social media. I didn't change my phone number. I stayed in my small apartment, and I kept driving that old car. I wanted to see if the bridge my father burned was truly gone, or if there was still a spark of family left beneath the ego. Back in the present, I heard a sharp rap on my guest room door. It was the head maid, Maria. Her face was tied with worry. "Miss Elena, your cousin Sarah. She's asked the tow truck to arrive in 10 minutes. She said the car is an eyesore for the guests arriving for the pre-gala brunch. She told them to take it to the scrapyard." I stood up, smoothing my charcoal dress. A cold, calm fire settled in my gut. Sarah thought she could erase my struggle by crushing the metal that carried me through it. "Let them come, Maria," I said softly. "But tell the driver to wait. There's something he needs to see first." I headed toward the stairs, wondering if Sarah realized that by trying to scrap my past, she was about to incinerate her own future. The gravel driveway was already humming with activity. A flatbed tow truck sat idling near the weeping willows, its amber lights rotating in a rhythmic, silent pulse against the morning fog. Sarah stood on the porch, her arms crossed over her cashmere wrap, looking down at my old sedan, like it was a carcass that needed to be cleared away before the vultures arrived. "I'm doing you a favor, Elena," Sarah called out as I stepped onto the porch. Her voice was light, almost airy, as if she were discussing the weather rather than destroying my only mode of transport. "The neighbors are starting to stare. Besides, this thing is a death trap. I've already called a premium car service for you. They'll take you wherever you need to go for the rest of the weekend. Consider it my birthday gift to Grandmama removing the eyesore." The tow truck driver, a burly man named Gus with grease-stained cuticles, looked at me with a pained expression. He held a clipboard in one hand and a heavy iron chain in the other. He knew this was a family feud, and he clearly didn't want to be the middleman. "Miss?" Gus asked, looking from Sarah to me. "The lady says this vehicle is abandoned and needs to be scrapped. Is that right?" I didn't look at Sarah. I walked down the steps, my heels crunching on the gravel, and stood next to my car. I placed a hand on the cool faded metal of the roof. This car had been my only friend when the world turned its back. It had shivered with me in the winter and sweltered with me in the summer. It had carried me to the meetings where I finally secured my first $1 million contract. "It's not abandoned," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the lawn. "And it's certainly not for scrap." I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, sleek black transponder, a device far more modern than anything Sarah or Julian had ever seen. I pressed a button, and a low melodic chime echoed from the device. "Gus," I said, turning to the driver. "I appreciate you coming out. But instead of towing this car, I'd like you to do something else. I'd like you to check the registration on the black SUV that just pulled into the lower gate." As if on cue, a matte black Escalade rolled silently up the driveway, stopping behind the tow truck. Two men in dark suits stepped out. They didn't look like family friends. They looked like security. Sarah's brow furrowed. "Elena? Who are these people?" "I didn't invite any more staff." "They aren't staff, Sarah," I said, finally turning to look at her. "They're my logistics team." And the envelope I left on the table. It wasn't a birthday card. It was a bill of sale for the Oak Ridge Estate's neighboring lot. The one Julian wanted for his tennis courts? "I bought it this morning." The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. Julian, who had been watching from the balcony above, gripped the stone railing so hard his knuckles turned white. You bought the West lot." Julian shouted down, his voice cracking. "That's prime real estate. That's millions. Where would someone like you get that kind of capital?" I didn't answer him. I turned back to Gus. "I'll pay you triple your call-out fee to just leave the car where it is. It's staying." "It's a reminder." Gus nodded quickly, took the cash I handed him, and backed his truck down the drive as fast as he could. The security team stood like statues near the Escalade, their presence a silent wall between me and my cousin's mounting fury. As I walked back toward the house, I felt a shift in the air. The failed cousin was no longer just an embarrassment. I was a mystery. But they still didn't understand the scale of what I had built. They thought I had saved up a little money to buy a piece of dirt to spite them. They had no idea that the West lot was just a landing pad for what was coming. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Sarah hissed as I passed her. She smelled of expensive lilac and desperation. "Buying a field doesn't make you one of us again, Elena. You're still the girl in the rusted car. You're still the one who was kicked out." "I wasn't kicked out, Sarah," I said, stopping at the door. "I was released. There's a difference." That night, as the preparations for the gala reached a fever pitch, I sat in my room and opened my laptop. I looked at the flight coordinates for the weekend's finale. The family was planning to take a private charter to the coast for the Sunday brunch. They were bragging about the luxury of a mid-sized Gulfstream. I checked my own app. My pilot had just sent a confirmation. "Bird is ready for departure Sunday morning, Miss Oak Ridge. Hangar 4, all systems green." I closed the laptop and looked out the window. Down in the driveway, Julian was kicking the tire of my old car in a fit of silent rage. He thought he was winning because he had a better suit, but I was playing a game he didn't even know existed. And tomorrow, at the gala, I was going to let them see the first glimpse of the ghost they had tried to bury. The question wasn't whether they would accept me back. The question was whether, by the time the sun set tomorrow, they would even be able to afford to stay in the same room as me. The morning of grandmother's 80th birthday arrived with a silver sky and the frantic energy of a house preparing for a royal coronation. From my window, I watched the caterers unload crates of champagne and white lily, their movements precise and hushed. The estate was transforming into a stage, and I was expected to be the background noise. A soft chime signaled a message on my phone. I picked it up, expecting a work update, but it was a group text from Sarah. "Elena, Julian and I were talking. We know things have been tight for you. We don't want you feeling out of place tonight among the governor's staff and our investors. We've gone ahead and booked you a seat on the 6 a.m. Greyhound bus back to the city for Sunday morning. We'll even cover the Uber to the station so you don't have to risk that old clunker breaking down on the highway again. You're welcome." I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the darkened glass of my window. It wasn't just an insult. It was a strategic move to ensure I wasn't present for the final leg of the celebration, the exclusive Sunday brunch. At the island estate, they wanted me gone before the real power players arrived. I didn't reply. I simply set the phone face down on the mahogany vanity. A knock followed, and Julian strolled in without waiting for an invitation. He was already dressed in a tailored navy blazer, looking every bit the heir to a fortune he hadn't earned. He leaned against the doorframe, checking his gold watch. Did you get the text? He asked, his voice smooth and condescending. It's for the best, Elle. Tonight is going to be high pressure. Lots of cameras. Lots of talk about the family's future acquisitions. You just be sitting there in that whatever dress you bought at the mall, feeling like a charity case. This way you get a head start on your week. He walked over to my vanity and picked up a small, crystal perfume bottle, a gift from my mother before she passed. He turned it over in his hands carelessly. I heard you bought the West lot, he said, his tone shifting to something sharper, more dangerous. Cute play, trying to block my tennis courts. But you should know I've already filed a zoning grievance. By the time my lawyers are done, that dirt will be worthless. You wasted your little startup savings on a spite buy, Elena. You should have used it to buy a car that doesn't smell like wet carpet. I looked at him through the reflection in the mirror. I didn't flinch. The West lot isn't for a tennis court, Julian. And I didn't buy it for spite. He scoffed, setting the perfume bottle down with a sharp clack. Whatever you say. Just make sure you're packed by tonight. The bus doesn't wait for tech CEOs who can't afford gas. He vanished back into the hallway, his laughter echoing faintly. I turned back to my laptop. I had a final Zoom call before the gala began. On the screen appeared Marcus Thorne, the head of Thorne Aviation. The hangar is prepped, Elena, Marcus said, his expression professional yet warm. The Gulfstream G650 is fueled and the crew is on standby. We've also finalized the acquisition papers for your family's logistics firm. If you sign tonight, you'll technically be your cousin's landlord by Monday morning. I looked at the digital contract, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. The Oakrish family business was struggling, something Sarah and Julian were too busy spending money to notice. They were drowning in debt, and I was the only one with a life jacket. Wait until tomorrow, I said softly. I want them to enjoy the party first. Understood, Marcus replied. And about the car, your driver is concerned about the aesthetic of the pickup. I glanced out at the driveway where my old sedan sat, stubborn and gray against the green lawn. The car stays until the very last second. I want them to see it. I want them to believe I have nothing. As I closed the laptop, a heavy silk garment bag was delivered to my door. It wasn't the mall dress Julian expected. It was a custom-made gown of midnight blue silk, stitched with microscopic silver thread that only caught the light when I moved. It was the dress of a woman who didn't just belong at the table, she owned the room. But as I touched the fabric, a flicker of doubt crossed my mind. Was I doing this for the right reasons? Or was I becoming exactly like them, obsessed with the spectacle of power? I looked at the old car once more. No. This wasn't about the money. It was about the 3 years of silence. It was about the night I was told I was nothing. Tonight, the gala would begin. Tomorrow, the flight would depart. And somewhere in between, Sarah and Julian were going to realize that the charity case they tried to ship off on a bus was actually the person holding the keys to their entire world. But there was one more secret I hadn't even told Marcus. A secret that was currently sitting in the glove box of that old rusted sedan. The evening air was thick with the scent of expensive gasoline and crushed gravel as the first line of luxury SUVs began to snake up the Oakridge driveway. I stood by the window, watching the parade of wealth. Sarah and Julian were in their element, standing on the grand portico like twin monarchs, greeting guests with practiced smiles and hollow laughter. I looked down at the midnight blue gown hanging on the door. Then, I looked at the old faded jeans and the worn sweater I had laid out on the bed. I wasn't going to the gala in the gown. Not yet. I dressed quickly in my old clothes, the fabric smelling of the detergent I used back in my basement apartment. I grabbed my keys and headed downstairs, moving through the back service halls to avoid the main foyer. I reached the driveway just as a silver Porsche pulled up. The driver glanced at my rusted sedan with a look of pure confusion, as if seeing a ghost in a ballroom. Elena. It was Sarah. She was radiant in a gold sequin dress that caught every stray beam of light. She hurried down the steps, her heels clicking like a countdown. What are you doing? The gala starts in 20 minutes. Why are you dressed like a mechanic? She hissed, her eyes darting around to see if any important guests were watching. I have an errand to run, Sarah, I said, my voice as calm as a still lake. I'll be back for the toast. An errand? In that? She gestured wildly at my car. Julian told you the bus is tomorrow morning. If you leave now, don't bother coming back. You're embarrassing the family name in front of the senator. The family name has survived worse than a dusty car, Sarah, I replied. I climbed into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with its familiar labored groan, coughing a puff of gray smoke into the pristine evening air. I saw Sarah press a hand to her forehead in theatrical despair as I backed down the drive, the muffler rattling a defiant rhythm against the silence of the estate. I drove toward the city, leaving the lights of Oak Ridge behind. The highway was a ribbon of black, punctuated by the rhythmic thump-thump of my tires over the expansion joints. About 40 miles out, exactly where I knew it would happen, the engine gave a sickening metallic shudder. The temperature gauge spiked into the red, and a thin wisp of steam began to curl from under the hood. I pulled onto the shoulder, the car rolling to a halt in the tall, dead grass. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat there for a moment, my hands still on the steering wheel. I wasn't angry, I wasn't even surprised. This car had given me everything it had, and it was finally tired. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a FaceTime call from Julian. I answered it. His face appeared on the screen, flushed with champagne and triumph. Behind him, I could hear the tinkling of crystal glasses and a string quartet playing Vivaldi. GPS says you're stationary on the I-95L, he chuckled, leaning back against a marble pillar. Run out of luck? Or did the CEO lifestyle finally hit a speed bump? Sarah says she's already had your room cleared out. We figured since you left in such a hurry, you were just getting a head start on that Greyhound. The car overheated. Julian, I said, keeping my face neutral. How poetic, he sneered. A breakdown for a breakdown life. Stay there, Elena. Maybe a highway patrolman will feel sorry for you. We're about to start the main course lobster thermidor. Too bad you'll be dining on exhaust fumes. He hung up. I looked at the darkened dashboard. I reached over and opened the glove box. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old napkins and a manual, was a small sealed plastic bag. Inside the bag was a single vintage key with a heavy brass fob and a legal document I had signed 3 years ago, the very day I was disowned. My father had thought he stripped me of everything, but he had forgotten one thing. The offshore account my mother had set up in my name when I was a child. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to seed my company. And it was the reason I had kept this car. The registration wasn't just in my name. It was the primary asset of a holding company that now owned the very debt Julian and Sarah were currently spending. I stepped out of the car and looked back toward Oak Ridge. A pair of bright headlights appeared in the distance, approaching fast. It wasn't a tow truck. It was a sleek black limousine. The driver pulled up behind my smoking sedan and stepped out. He didn't look at the car with disgust. He bowed slightly. Miss Oak Ridge, your gown is in the back. We have 40 minutes to get you to the gala for the final announcement. Thank you, Marcus, I said. I looked at my old car one last time. Have a flatbed pick her up tomorrow. I want her brought to Hangar 4. She's earned a spot in the collection. As I slid into the cool leather interior of the limo, the contrast was jarring. The scent of new leather and chilled air replaced the smell of oil and old fabric. I began to change into the midnight blue gown, the silk sliding over my skin like water. The cousins thought I was stranded on a highway, a victim of my own poverty. They didn't realize that the breakdown was the final piece of the performance. I wanted them to feel entirely safe. I wanted them to be at their most arrogant when I walked through those doors. Because the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a person with power, it's a person everyone thinks has none. But as the limo sped back toward the estate, I noticed a missed call on my phone. Not from Sarah, not from Julian, and not from my office. It was from my father's private lawyer. The message was short. Elena, your father has seen the acquisition news. He's waiting in the library. He knows everything. My heart skipped a beat. If my father knew, the surprise at the gala was no longer just about the cousins. It was a confrontation 20 years in the making. The Oak Ridge ballroom was a cathedral of light and ego. Huge crystal chandeliers hummed with a low electric warmth, casting long, dancing shadows across the faces of the city's elite. I stood at the edge of the terrace, the midnight blue silk of my gown blending into the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. I looked like a ghost haunting my own family's celebration. Inside, Sarah was the center of a laughing circle, her gold sequins shimmering like scales. She was holding a flute of vintage Bollinger, her head tilted back in that practiced aristocratic way. Julian was nearby, clapping a senator on the shoulder, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who believes the ground he walks on was created for his convenience. Has anyone seen our little runaway? Julian's voice boomed, carrying over the soft swell of the string quartet. I heard she's currently enjoying a scenic view of the I-95. Apparently, her empire doesn't include roadside assistance. A ripple of polite, cruel laughter moved through the crowd. I watched Sarah lean in, her voice a stage whisper. It's tragic, really. We tried to help her. We even offered her a bus ticket. Some people are just destined for the shoulder of the road, I suppose. I stepped out from behind the curtain. I didn't enter with a shout. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked into the light. The room didn't go silent all at once. It happened in waves, starting from the guests nearest to the terrace and moving inward like a freezing lake. The midnight blue of my dress caught the light, the silver threads glowing like a galaxy. It was a dress that cost more than Julian's car, and I wore it with the ease of someone who had earned the right to breathe. Sarah froze. Her glass tilted slightly, champagne spilling onto her gold-tipped fingers. Julian's laugh died in his throat, his hand still frozen on the senator's shoulder. "You're late for the toast, Sarah," I said, my voice low and perfectly steady. I walked toward them, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. I didn't look at the guests. I kept my eyes on my cousins. And you were wrong. The view on the I-95 was actually quite illuminating. It reminded me of exactly what I left behind. "Elena," Sarah stammered, her face pale beneath her heavy makeup. How did you get here? That dress. That's a Valenti. It's a one-of-one piece. How could you possibly? I have a good tailor, I interrupted softly. And an even better driver. Julian stepped forward, his eyes narrowing, trying to regain his footing. So what? You spent your last dime on a dress to try and save face? You're still a failure, Elena. You're still the girl who was disowned. This little masquerade doesn't change the fact that by Monday, your startup will be a footnote. I reached out and took a glass of water from a passing waiter's tray. I didn't want the champagne. I wanted my head clear. Actually, Julian, I said, I'm glad you mentioned Monday. You see, the gala tonight was supposed to celebrate Grandmama's legacy. But since you and Sarah have spent the last hour talking about business and my failures, I think it's only fair we discuss the Oak Ridge Logistics Group. The senator's ears perked up. Several board members moved closer. Julian's chest puffed out. Our firm is doing just fine. We're expanding. We're the backbone of this family. You're a hollow shell, I said, the words falling like stones into a well. You've leveraged the estate against 3 different high-interest loans to fund your lifestyle. You're 3 weeks away from a liquidity crisis that would make the 2008 crash look like a minor inconvenience. But you already know that, don't you? That's why you wanted the West lot. You needed the land to sell to the developers to cover the interest. The room was deathly quiet now. The only sound was the faint hiss of the candles. That's a lie, Sarah hissed, though her eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit. It's not, a new voice boomed. My father stepped out from the library at the far end of the ballroom. He looked older than I remembered, his hair completely white, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. In his hand, he held the cream-colored envelope I had left on the hallway table that morning. He walked toward us, his gaze never leaving mine. He ignored Sarah and Julian entirely. He stopped a foot away from me and held up the envelope. I opened it, he said. Julian scoffed. Then you saw it, Dad. It's probably a demand for more money or some pathetic apology. My father turned his head slowly toward Julian. The look in his eyes was one of pure cold disappointment. It's a buyout offer, Julian. For the entire Oak Ridge portfolio. At a 20% premium above market value. It's signed by the CEO of Ether Global. He turned back to me, his voice trembling just a fraction. Why didn't you tell me, Elena? Why let us believe you were? This? He gestured to my old life, to the image of the girl in the rusted car. Because I wanted to see if you loved the daughter or the dividend, I said. And I think I got my answer 3 years ago. I turned to the crowd, raising my glass of water. To my grandmother. Happy birthday. I hope you enjoy the island tomorrow. The weather is supposed to be perfect for flying. I turned and walked away, leaving my father standing in the center of the room with the ruins of his son's pride in his hand. But as I reached the foyer, I saw the lawyer from the phone call waiting by the door. The flight plan has been updated, Miss Oak Ridge, he whispered. But there's a problem, your cousins. They've already tried to seize the hangar keys. They think they can stop you from leaving, I smiled. It was a cold, sharp thing. Let them try. They're still thinking in terms of cars and rows. They haven't looked at the sky yet. The morning of the island excursion arrived with a heavy salt-tinged fog that clung to the windows of the estate. The atmosphere in the house had shifted from arrogant celebration to a frantic, whispered desperation. I could hear Sarah and Julian in the hallway, their voices sharp and jagged like broken glass. They were no longer mocking me. They were scrambling to save themselves. The plan for the day was simple for the rest of the family. A fleet of town cars would take the important guests to the regional airport, where a chartered mid-sized jet waited to fly them to Grandmama's private island. It was a tradition, a show of wealth that the Oak Ridge family could no longer actually afford. I was sitting in the conservatory, sipping a cup of black tea when Julian burst in. His tie was loosened, and his eyes were bloodshot. Gone was the polished air. In his place was a man who realized his throne was made of cardboard. You think you've won, don't you? He spat, slamming a set of heavy brass keys onto the glass-top table. The be out. The dress. The dramatic entrance. But you've forgotten one thing, Elena. The charter company for today? They're old friends of mine. I called in every favor I have. I told them your credit was flagged. I told them you were a security risk. He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across my tea. You aren't getting on that plane. And neither is your logistics team. You can sit here in your expensive dress and watch the rest of us fly over you. You're grounded, Elena, permanently. I didn't look up from my tea. I watched the steam curl into the air, a miniature storm in a porcelain cup. Is that so, Julian? You spend your morning making phone calls to a charter company. Every single one, he bragged, a manic glint in his eye. Sarah is already at the airport, making sure the manifests are locked. You're blacklisted. You want to get to the island? Start driving. Maybe that old sedan of yours can swim. I finally looked at him. I felt a strange sense of pity. He was fighting for a seat on a bus while I was looking at the stars. Julian, I said softly, the charter company you're talking about. They specialize in mid-range turboprops and light jets, right? The Silver Wing Group? The best in the state, he snapped. They filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy at 4 o'clock this morning, I said, setting my tea down with a delicate clink. Their fleet is grounded by the FAA for safety violations. My company, Ether, bought their debt-to-equity ratio last night. If you're looking for your friends, I suggest you check the unemployment office. Julian's face went from a heated red to a sickly translucent gray. He reached for the table to steady himself. What? No, they said they were fueling up. They were lying to you because they didn't want to admit they were out of business, I said. Just like you've been lying to Grandma about the estate's taxes. I stood up, smoothing my traveling clothes, a sharp tailored pantsuit in ivory wool. I picked up my bag. The town cars are outside. I suggest you get in one. The weather is closing in, and if you aren't at the airport in 30 minutes, you're going to be very lonely in this empty house. I walked past him, leaving him staring at the brass keys on the table keys to a plane that would never take off. The drive to the airport was silent. I rode in a separate car from the rest of the family. Through the tinted glass, I saw the caravan of luxury vehicles carrying Sarah, my father, and the rest of the shell-shocked relatives. When we arrived at the private terminal, the scene was chaos. Sarah was screaming at a confused gate agent behind a desk. What do you mean grounded? Do you know who we are? We have a reservation. We have a legacy. The agent looked like she wanted to crawl under the desk. I'm sorry, ma'am. The Silver Wing fleet has been seized. There are no other charters available. Every plane in the region is booked for the tech summit. My father stood to the side, looking at the floor. He looked smaller than he had the night before. He looked like a man who finally realized his name didn't carry the weight it used to. I walked into the terminal, my heels echoing on the polished linoleum. The family turned as one, their faces a mask of fury and hope. Elena, Sarah ran toward me, her voice shrill. You did this. You sabotaged the flight. Now we're all stuck here like commoners in a bus station. Fix it. Call your logistics people and get us a plane. I looked at the terminal clock. 10 a.m. I can't fix your charter, Sarah, I said. That company is gone. Then what are we supposed to do? Julian demanded, appearing behind her, his breath smelling of morning scotch. Grandma is already on the island. The guests are waiting. If we don't show up, the family is finished. We'll be the laughingstock of the entire coast. I looked at my phone. A single notification. Hangar 4. Ready for boarding. There is one plane leaving today, I said. But it doesn't belong to a charter company. And it doesn't care about the Oak Ridge name. I turned and began walking toward the heavy steel doors that led to the tarmac. Where are you going? My father called out, his voice cracking. To my flight, I replied without looking back. If you want a ride, I suggest you stop shouting and start walking. But there's a condition. I stopped at the door and looked over my shoulder. Only the people who can admit they were wrong are allowed on the manifest. Everyone else. Well, I hear the Greyhound station has a very nice vending machine. The question wasn't whether they would follow me. The question was whether their pride was more important than their destination. But as the doors opened and the wind from the runway whipped my hair across my face, I saw something that made even my heart skip a beat. In the distance, sitting in front of the massive gleaming hangar, was a small familiar shape. My old rusted sedan. And standing next to it was a man in a pilot's uniform, holding a sign that didn't say Oak Ridge. It said Either, but why was my car there? And who was the second person standing in the shadow of the wing, waiting for me? The tarmac was a desolate stretch of wet asphalt, the fog swirling around the tires of the various grounded planes like a cold, gray sea. My family followed me in a ragged line, their designer shoes splashing through puddles. They looked like refugees of a kingdom that had fallen overnight. Sarah was clutching her gold handbag as if it were a life raft, and Julian walked with his head down, the bravado finally drained from his posture. As we approached Hangar 4, the massive corrugated steel doors began to slide open with a low, tectonic hum. The interior was a temple of white light and industrial perfection. And there in the center of the vast space, sat the Ether, a Gulfstream G650. Its fuselage was a deep, matte charcoal, polished to such a high sheen that it reflected the hangar lights like a mirror. It didn't just look like a plane. It looked like a weapon of pure efficiency. But it was the sight next to the boarding stairs that stopped everyone in their tracks. There sat my 2005 sedan. It had been washed, the grime of the I-95 scrubbed it away, though the rust and the faded paint remained a proud scar on its metal skin. Standing beside it was Marcus, my head of logistics, and an older man in a charcoal suit I hadn't seen in years. Uncle Arthur? I whispered. It was my father's estranged brother, the one who had been cast out 20 years ago for the same rebellious spirit they had tried to crush in me. He smiled at me, a sharp, knowing look in his eyes. He had been my secret investor, the silent partner who had helped me turn a basement startup into a global powerhouse. You kept the car, Elena, Arthur said, his voice a gravelly rumble. I told you it would remind you where the ground is, even when you're 30,000 feet up. My father stopped a few feet away, his gaze darting between his brother, the jet, and the rusted car. Arthur, you've been behind this? You've been helping her build this empire while we were struggling? She didn't need much help, brother, Arthur replied, his voice devoid of malice but heavy with truth. She just needed someone who didn't view her as a line item on a balance sheet. Something you haven't managed to do in 3 decades. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes wide as she looked up at the towering tail of the Gulfstream. This is yours? Truly yours? Elena, I didn't know. We thought you were just struggling. You didn't think I was struggling, Sarah, I said, my voice as calm as the air inside the pressurized cabin. You hoped I was struggling. You needed me to be the failure so you could feel like a success. The wind kicked up, whistling through the hangar. The pilot signaled it was time to move. The fog was thickening, and the window for departure was closing. The manifest is set, I announced, turning to the group. The jet has 16 seats. I've already filled 10 with my engineering team, who are meeting us at the island to finalize the acquisition of the Oak Ridge firm. Julian's head snapped up. The acquisition? You're really going through with it? You're buying us out? I'm saving the employees, Julian, I corrected. The board of directors, specifically you and Sarah, will be stepping down effective immediately. You'll be given a severance package that is fair, but modest. It should be enough to cover the rent on a very nice 2-bedroom apartment. Perhaps you can find one near a bus line. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked like he wanted to scream, but the sheer, overwhelming reality of the jet and the security team standing behind me stifled the sound in his throat. He realized then that the silent power move I had been making for 3 years was now a checkmate. I looked at my father. He looked at the old car, then at the jet, and finally at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't judgment. It was recognition. I don't deserve a seat on that plane, he said softly. No, I agreed, you don't, but grandmother is waiting. And she'd be disappointed if her son wasn't there to see what her granddaughter built. I turned and began to climb the stairs. Sarah, Julian, you can stay here and wait for the fog to clear. I'm sure a commercial flight will open up in a day or 2. Or, you can take the car. I pointed to the 2005 sedan. The keys are in the ignition, I said with a small tilted smile. It's reliable. It'll get you where you need to go, as long as you don't mind the noise. I didn't wait for their answer. I walked into the cabin, where the scent of jasmine and expensive leather greeted me. I sat in the captain's chair, the plush cream upholstery molding to my frame. Through the window, I watched as my father slowly began to climb the stairs behind me. Down on the tarmac, Sarah and Julian stood alone next to the rusted sedan. They looked small, diminished by the vastness of the hangar and the shadow of the wing. Sarah reached out and touched the hood of the old car, her gold-tipped fingers looking garish against the faded gray paint. As the engines began their high-pitched, melodic whine, I felt the vibration of the floor beneath my feet. It was a different vibration than the rattle of the sedan. It was smooth, powerful, and limitless. We taxied out of the hangar, leaving the Oak Ridge estate and its petty dramas in the mist. As we lifted off, The G650 sliced through the gray layer of fog, breaking into the brilliant, blinding gold of the morning sun. I looked down at the clouds below. Somewhere under that white blanket, two people were probably trying to figure out how to start a 20-year-old engine. I leaned back and picked up my phone. I had one more call to make. "Marcus," I said as the world fell away below us. "Prepare the press release. The Oak Ridge name isn't retiring. It's just finally under new management. The family legacy wasn't dead. It had just finally found its wings."